Welcome to the second presentation about vocabulary in this module. While the first presentation focused more on how to not use the wrong word and use the best word for the job, this presentation will focus on building your vocabulary, empowering you to be an active vocabulary learner. And we really do need to think about vocabulary as something that is sort of a lifelong journey. That sounds a little corny, but it's really a challenge for everyone to continue to accrue more words and use more words comfortably. So we often have a lot of words that we might recognize or know but aren't really comfortable writing with them or speaking them. And there's always new words being coined, so we need to stay on top of new words both in our field and in the general lexicon. Just to give you an idea, what is considered a really great vocabulary or a large vocabulary might be around 30,000 words. A production vocabulary that will get you by in life as a reader and writer is about 15,000 words. Of course, it's hard to measure how many words we actually know. That would be a long exercise, but just remember that it is something we're always working toward, adding new thousands of words, hopefully, to our vocabulary over time. And in our quest to improve our vocabulary, the most obvious and best tool is really a dictionary, and in particular, a thesaurus. So I personally never write without a thesaurus by my side. These days I use just the one that's available as an application on my MacBook, but sometimes I'll pull up thesaurus.com or an online thesaurus, and occasionally I will whip out the print thesaurus to have next to me. This is really a phenomenal tool for both the writing process when you're trying to look for a better word, or especially in the revision and editing process when you're going through and trying to improve your clarity and your specificity and precision. So I highly recommend that you invest in a good thesaurus or make it a practice of having one on your computer, either as an application or online. Some other ways to build vocabulary are, unsurprisingly, to read. So the more we read, the more words we learn, especially if we read actively, which is to say when you come across a word that you aren't quite sure of the meaning or that you have no idea what it means, you look it up. And this will help you build your vocabulary over time. And read across disciplines. So you should be reading in your own discipline, of course, but you can also read popular magazines, newspapers, fiction. These are all places to discover new words. You can also build your vocabulary by editing your own work. So as you go through your work, if you know that you tend to be a wordy writer, you go on a little bit too long perhaps, try to find some of those wordier phrases and see if you can find a word in the dictionary or in the thesaurus that gets the point across in just one word instead of maybe 4 or 5. You can also play word games. There are many. If you Google word games, you'll find things like Text Twist online that are really fun. You can download apps on your phone to play as well. There's also good old-fashioned crossword puzzles, which can help build your vocabulary, and games like Scrabble. And then digitally, signing up for Word-A-Day newsletters, there's lots of them out there, can help you incrementally grow that vocabulary, and utilize the thesaurus and dictionary in Microsoft Word as well. So just to give a larger frame for this quest for more vocabulary, this is sort of framed within the challenge of concision versus precision, which is a constant tension in our writing, right? So we always want to be as concise as possible. We don't want to make people read unnecessarily when we could have gotten the point across in less words, especially with time being so precious these days. And then precise. We also want to be really specific and get across our actual point and not be misunderstood. So the right vocabulary can really help you in this quest to strike a balance between concision and precision. If you can be precise and concise at the same time by finding the perfect word or a very specific advanced word, then you are succeeding as a writer. And this also means avoiding meaningless words or replacing them, as we talked about in the previous presentation, words like very, so, and good, for example, that don't work for you quite as effectively as more specific or advanced complex words can. Just an example of what I mean by this tension. So, something that might be too concise are the results are inconclusive. Of course, this depends on the context. Perhaps this is the end of a long paragraph, and that would be just fine. But there's not that much going on in this sentence. Going sort of to the other side of that would be adding a little, maybe too much information. On the one hand, the results show that drip irrigation could yield significant cost savings, while on the other hand, The data is skewed due to abnormal precipitation patterns during the study. As a result, we have determined that the results are inconclusive. Of course, there are some assets to being this precise. We know exactly what is being said, but could we probably cut some words here and be more efficient? Yes, and maybe we are adding a little bit too much detail. So an example of how to strike a good balance would be, while our research indicates that drip irrigation is cost effective. So indicates is a good verb there. It's replacing a lot of the words in the sentence above. The skewed study conditions render results inconclusive. So yes, we don't have a little bit of the detail from above, but we have gotten more or less the same point across in much fewer words, but also added enough detail for the sentence to stand on its own and be clear to the reader. In another thing that we want to do in our writing by building vocabulary is to be unique. So using advanced vocabulary can allow us to actually be kind of creative and write in a way that no one else does. And that stands on the opposite of what are called cliches, which you might have heard of. These are kind of overused phrases or words. And when we use them, it's sort of the mark of an inexperienced writer, someone who needs to rely upon the words of others that have been recycled over and over again throughout the printed world. So you want to avoid using phrases like this and try to come up with words that might both make your writing more concise and also more unique to show that you are a strong writer. So just a few examples of some cliched phrases. In this day and age, instead, we might just say currently, nowadays. This is kind of a colloquial phrase, and instead we might just say today or currently again. Only time will tell. This is an overused phrase for sure. Instead, you might be more specific about when time will tell and what it will tell. Without a doubt, you could replace with certainly or indubitably. In the same boat is another phrase we see often. You can just say they have a parallel experience, or they similarly, for example, it depends on the context. Calm before the storm. This is another very overused phrase. So just try to think when you're especially editing your own work, have I seen this phrase before? Am I copying it from somewhere else unintentionally? And then get it out of there. Words are less often referred to as cliched, but some that I often see in papers are referring to people or society. So instead, you might just talk about humans, or you can get even more precision by being specific. So talking about which people you're specifically talking about, which society you're talking about. It's very hard to generalize these days and say all people or every society experiences things the same way. So another part of building vocabulary is active reading, which I alluded to earlier. And this isn't only just about looking up every word that you see that you're not quite sure about. It's also about reading sort of with a detective's mind. So this can help you identify what a word might mean before you even need to look it up. And sometimes we are reading on the go. We don't have a dictionary or access to the internet to be able to look it up. So this can be really helpful in those situations. And also, the more time you spend sort of thinking about investigating a word, the more it's going to stick with you. So ways to do this are to try to identify what part of speech the word is. So do we think it's a noun? Do we think it's a verb? Is it an adjective or an adverb? Is it a preposition? Those you probably already know. And then you want to start to look for parts of the word. So breaking it into sections or syllables. So there are prefixes, which is the beginning of a word, suffixes, which are the ends of words typically, roots, which tend to come in the middle, although there are many exceptions. And you want to try to think with these parts of the word about what it might remind you of. So decontextualize it from its current word and think about other words that it might remind you of, and this might hold clues to what it actually means. So in determining what kind of parts of speech a word might be, you can look for common suffixes that tend to indicate whether it's a noun, for example, or a verb. So we know, for example, that words that end with age, ment, us, er tend to be nouns. There are many exceptions to this, of course, but you might be able to say, okay, it ends with ation, it's probably a noun, and it's probably referring to a process of becoming, for example. Or it ends with ment, this also probably refers to an action or a process. You might start to pick up on patterns. Verb, when we see ize, ify, en, ate, these suffixes are often applied to nouns to turn them into verbs, but it also gives you a clue that they're trying to indicate action. And adjectives, we often see these end in able, ile, ous, ary, so that gives you a clue that this word is serving as a descriptor. And just as we went over in the previous presentation, if it ends in ly, it's very, very good chance that it's an adverb as well. So that means it's a descriptor for a verb. So this can help you just figure out what's going on in a sentence if there are a lot of complicated words and you need to identify parts of speech. So let's take a minute and practice. Look at the words here. You can pause the presentation and look for what you recognize. So look at the suffixes to try to determine what part of speech it is. Is it a noun? Is it a verb? And then look for prefixes, roots, suffixes that you might recognize from other words, and try to think about what these words might mean. So hopefully you guessed some of these right. I'll just go through them quickly. For example, rapidity, you often see ity added to turn an adjective into a noun, for example. So we recognize rapid, you might know that means fast, and so rapidity means something, the quality of moving quickly. Another example, deliberately, you might recognize ly in there, so we know that it's an adverb. And you might recognize in the middle liberal, libera, which means sort of done of free will, done intentionally, not being forced to do so. Victimize, similar with rapidity, we recognize victim in there, which many of you probably know that word. We see eyes, so we know it's a verb, and we can guess that it means to make someone a victim. Tertiary, some of you might recognize from Latin tertius, so we know that this means third. Disruptive, perhaps a little bit harder to uncrack, but if you see rup in there, you might think of rupture or to break apart, causing disruption, for example. Darken is a pretty obvious one. Most of you probably know what this means, but we see dark in there, we see en, and therefore we can assume that as a verb it means to make dark. Bionic is a little bit trickier because we have the bio root, which we know means life, yet this means having artificial parts that mimic life. So that shows you that sometimes this method does not always work. Of course, it's related to the idea of life, but it's not so straightforward. And then finally, enumerate. We know num means number, so enumerate, you might be able to extrapolate from the context, means to make a list of things or to count the number of things. And let's do the same thing here. This is a list of some stems that you might find in a lot of different words, especially in the sciences, academic sciences. So pause the presentation, take a second, and try to guess what the meaning of these stems might be, and think of some example words that use the stem. So again, here's the big reveal, and you might recognize from annual or anniversary, and their meaning is year. Cred is often used in words like credible, credential, credibility, and this means believe. So in a word like credibility, if you talk about the credibility of a source, you would say our ability to believe in it, for example. Dict means say, dictate. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is a good slide to potentially take a screenshot of and keep near and dear as you read and find words that you aren't sure of. You can try to look for these roots and stems. And there's also a download in this module with a much larger list of familiar roots and stems and Latin prefixes that you can print out and take with you to the library, for example, or just keep by your side as you research. And when you come across a word you don't know, you can try to identify it. And this will work in your favor in the long term. So the more you will start to understand and recognize roots and stems and prefixes, the better reader you'll become, and the more your vocabulary will expand. Here's another quick quiz for you. So these are not necessarily words, but abbreviations, Latin abbreviations typically that are often found in academic writing or historic writing, and which you should generally try to recognize and understand. So take a minute again and pause this presentation. See if you can guess what these words or what these abbreviations mean, and if you want to get bonus points just for your own pride, if you know what the actual Latin full phrase is, that's bonus for you. That's extra points. So hopefully some of these were familiar. PM means afternoon. That one's pretty obvious. Postmeridium corresponding to AM, which would be before noon. IE, you'll see and probably use a lot, translates to id est, which is that is, and it's usually used in parentheses in writing to rephrase what you just said, or get a little bit deeper into what you just said. For example, that is to say, for example, some people consider it to be sloppy, so I wouldn't overuse it, but there is certainly a time and a place to use it. E.g., similarly, we usually put in parentheses, and it usually precedes examples. So we might give one example or a list of a few examples of what we were just talking about. CV, curriculum vitae, is a longer resume that usually has a weight toward academia and education. AD, Anno Domini, Year of the Lord, identifying what millennia we're in, basically, corresponding with CE, BC, BCE. You probably recognize all of those as well. Ad lib means at will. So you often see this in the terms of talking about improvisation. Et al. Is very common in sources, and most of you are probably familiar with this. It stands for et ali and means and others, to stand in for the long list of co-authors that might follow the first author. CF, confero, means to compare. So this is used in academia, but certainly less common. It would be used in the format of an in-text citation. So you might say, Smith argues this, in spite of others who argue something to the contrary. And then you might have an in-text citation that says CF and give a little bit of a nod to those who stand in opposition to who you just introduced, for example. And I added one more on here. ETC means etc. And others. We often see this at the end of a list. It's a little bit sloppy to include this in academic formal writing, so I would avoid it unless really necessary. If you set up a list with including, that automatically signals to the reader that the list is not comprehensive. So you don't necessarily need etc. at the end of that, because we know that you've only given us an example of a few of many. These are just a few other Latin expressions, so these are not necessarily abbreviations, but expressions that you'll often see in academic writing. So on the left, academic expressions, ibid, you were tested on in the first module, which means same as the previous source. Opcite, similar academic expression, means corresponding to a source that was already cited, so not necessarily the immediate previous source, but another one previously in the paper. SIC in brackets is used in a quote when the person making the quotation has an error. And you want to write the quote verbatim. You don't want to change what the words are, because that reduces your credibility, and there's issues with that that we won't go into here. But you can just show that it's not your error, it is theirs. So you would just put that right after the error. CF we just talked about. VIZ is short for a Latin expression. It's similar to IE, slightly different. Usually means that you're going to provide a more colorful or different type of example of what you just were talking about. So it's not necessarily rephrasing, but going a little bit deeper, for example. You might find this preceding a list or an explanation of what you just said. Then we have expressions with prepositions. In situ might be the most relevant for everyone here. That means on site. And then we have expressions that we find throughout disciplines, and also that have made it into sort of the popular lexicon. Sui generis meaning unique. Quid pro quo talks about an exchange. A caveat means an exception. Pro bono means you're doing it without compensation. So these are words that are so common in the English dictionary that they've actually been inserted into it and do not need to be in italics, even though they are not necessarily native English words. And then just a few more Latin prefixes, which are very common and which you will commonly see in academic writing as well, to be familiar with. As I said before, there's a download in this module with a much more comprehensive list, but these are a few that you should know. Pre, as in prefix, means before, as everyone probably knows. Hypo means under. Homo versus hetero, so homo would mean the same versus hetero meaning different, is applied to many different words. Contra meaning against. So even though these are Latin terms, or Latin prefixes rather, we do not write them in italics like we would another foreign word, because they are now just integrated into the English dictionary. So hopefully this empowers you to start building your vocabulary and reading more actively with the intent of doing so. And maybe you have an idea of how many words that you know, and you can set a goal for yourself. I want to learn, a new word a day, or 15 new words a month, or I want to learn 100 new words a year. Be as ambitious as you think is reasonable. And then remember that when you learn a new word, you need to start using it immediately. So instead of just looking it up and then putting that away, which will probably lead to you forgetting it, and certainly not facility in using it, work toward actually understanding the meaning. Look into the etymology. Where did the word come from? What are its origins? Practice talking, using that word that same day. So use it in conversation with somebody, or write an email using that word, or try to write with it if you're working on your draft. Record the words. So keep a journal or write it in your phone in a memo somewhere so that you're writing it down somewhere with its definition and with a sample sentence, for example. And then go back to it and review it. So maybe at the end of the week, or when you're sitting on the train or listening to a boring lecture, for example, in class, you can scroll through your list of new words from the week and test your knowledge, see what you remember. So all of these tools will help really keep the words active in your memory and work toward becoming a better writer ultimately.